Welcome to Haunted Hills, a podcast about small towns' big stories. I'm your host, Tegan Dawson. This history episode is about a Gippsland gold mining town, virtually a ghost town, Walhalla Victoria. The traditional custodians of this country are the people of the Kurnai Nation. The name Walhalla is derived from the German Walhalla, meaning the abode of gods and angels. It's a lovely place. A great tourist town today, nestled in the southern side of the Great Dividing Range north of Moe Victoria, while in the Borgo Council area. We're going to meet a group of business owners and residents in 1888 who were faced with the adversity of fire. A candle is the culprit. Through tough times, we meet the people. This is known as a Great Fire, where damages cost the community £80,000, 26 properties were destroyed. This includes community buildings like the Mechanics Institute and the library. Most buildings and businesses were underinsured. Nerd note, that's a loss of nearly $12.5 million today. The total change in cost is 7,689.6% over 118 years. You'll notice that the number starts from 1901. The RBA doesn't have details prior to that. However, the average annual inflation rate over this time was 3.8%. I have some wonderful Patreons who've supported me, and I love to give their loyalty a shout out. Thank you so much to Fred's Frog, Mick W. from Latrobe Valley Paranormal Detectives, Xander72, Colin B., Dale, Stuart M., and Lisa M. I'd also like to give a shout out to another long-time supporter who saw us during our time running tours into the podcast, Kevin B. of Cinematic Randomness. These guys have been with me since the beginning, and it means so much to me. A quick background about Walhalla before we meet the people. Even though Walhalla was a gold town, the buildings were built out of wood, because the track into Walhalla was difficult, making it costly to get the supplies in. Equipment for the gold mine was prioritised. Walhalla is flanked by two cliffs. This leads to some interesting places for community spaces, like the cricket grounds, which is up what feels like 1,000 stairs. Then you start to play the game. Thankfully, cricket is more about sprints than constant movements. Stringer's Creek runs through the middle of the town. The fire station is built over the creek. It's still there today. It's likely during this time in 1888 more buildings crossed the creek, because both sides of the street caught alight. Walhalla housed around 4,000 people at its peak, with all the businesses to support them. In 1888, the creek was low, there was hardly any water around. Even though summer hadn't even started yet, the fire broke out in the last days of November, which in Victoria is spring. It had been a dry winter. For our overseas listeners, Gippsland is a temperate climate with green rolling hills and eucalyptus bush. Gippsland has areas where the snow falls, like in the mountains, not far from Walhalla. In fact, Walhalla in 1905 had so much snowfall, it kept the residents in and anyone outside for a few days. Now, let's meet Walhalla's chemist, dentist and dressmaker, the mining manager, lawyer and grocer, the people affected by the Great Fire of Walhalla 1888, because people make the town. It was about 7 p.m. and a dressmaker was working on a dress for Darcy, who was being fitted for the bodice at the time. Carefully, she moved the candle around the fabric of the dress. She wasn't as careful when she placed it near the straw hats, catching them alight. The two women tried to put it out before calling for help. Unfortunately, the dressmaker is never named. Jake Crawford owned the property and noticed the flames, probably the smoke first. He raced in with woolen blankets to place over the fire. Unfortunately, the flames had already licked at the walls and roof, taking root there. That night, the gorge became like a wind tunnel, with fire moving like a vortex, a hungry beast consuming all that was in its path. The locals rallied, covering their faces in wet clothes to breathe through the smoke, which added to the confusion. In the twilight, the fire took over, residents overcoming the heat and fear of the fire set out to put wet blankets on the roofs of buildings to prevent embers taking them. Methods like this saved the Walhalla Town Hall, post office, and after a bit of negotiation and a turn in the wind, saved the Grand Junction Hotel. The bedtime routine was in full swing at Wolf and Kate Filchenfield's house. Behind the draper's shop front, the older children already in their beds around 7:30 p.m. Wolf was settling down after dinner to complete the books after a day of work. Kate was in the bathroom with 3-year-old Otto in the tub. When neighbours rushed in shouting there was a fire, Kate ripped the child from the bath while rushing out of the house with him in her arms, as Wolf and the neighbours ushered the other children clad in their pyjamas into the street. Suds and bathwater soaked Kate's side, dripping as naked Otto clung to her as she gathered the 3 other children like a mother hen. Kate took charge of her family, moving the children away from Crawford's drapery, not far from their shop and home. Wolf had learned how to deal with the fire-prone areas and continuing to operate a business. He already had lost a business at Woods Point with his brother, where they sold furniture and other goods. It was burnt out, so they had moved back to Walhalla. So by this time, in 1888, when the fire came, he was prepared, and within 14 days after the fire, he was already rebuilding and selling his wares again. Wolf Filchenfield was born in Brandenburg, Berlin, Germany. He came across alone as an assisted immigrant in 1866, leaving from London aboard the Shore Swift. There were 21 passengers, and 2 died in the 3-month journey. They were buried at sea. He was in business with his brother, most commonly known as Samuel. Samuel opened a store in Sale and travelled between Germany and Australia regularly until his marriage in 1896, where he married Jeanette Rose in Germany. They moved to Australia and settled down here. Otto went on to become a medical practitioner. Wolf made enough money while living in Walhalla that he was able to retire with independent means by 1900 when the family moved to Melbourne. Joseph Jenkins Jolly heard the main street was on fire and his building was threatened. He bolted down the street towards the blaze, pushing through the acrid smoke filling the air. He was shouting, "Dynamite! Dynamite!" hoping to avert the well-meaning townspeople who were evacuating his store, as 15 crates were stored in his stationery and fancy goods shop. He breathed a sigh of relief as other people caught on and called out dynamite, and everyone pulled back from his store just before it blew up. Thankfully, his family didn't live on site. There were private residences intermingled behind or beside these buildings. A sweet smell like caramel from nitroglycerin struck him as he pulled himself up from the ground. Once the debris stopped falling, he joined the rest of the community to help stop the total destruction of the main street. Joseph's wife, Annie, was at home 7 months pregnant at the time, with their first daughter, Annie, and their 3-year-old David and 18-month-old Joseph. Down the road, his father's butchery would also burn to the ground. The Jollies were second-generation community members in the Walhalla area. George Jolly had arrived in Australia as an assisted passenger with his wife Mary and Anna Maria in January 1853. 12 years later, they were in the Walhalla area working as butchers. The Jollies set themselves up near the gold mines, ensuring economic viability. It was shortly after this, George buried bones with apple seeds, which led to an apple tree growing on the banks of the Jordan River in the Walhalla area. 18 years after, every season he gave 12 pounds worth of apples.
True Crime Historian presents yesterday's news. Tales of the scandals, scoundrels, and scourges of the past, told through historic newspaper accounts in the golden age of yellow journalism. Whether it's a love triangle gone awry, a botched robbery, or the deadly shenanigans of a desperate fugitive, True Crime Historian has got the scoop. New episodes every Thursday at www.truecrimehistorian.com or whatever podcast player you love best.
Robert Henry Cow and Isabella at the time of the fire didn't live in their business in the main street. It's hard to know how they responded to the trauma and difficulty of living in the valley as their entire business district went up in flames. Robert's father came down after the fire and helped rebuild his son's business. The locals said he worked with the vitality of a man much younger than 60. There is a photo of the property. It had a curvy piece with his son's name carved into the top of the building. Otherwise, it has a feeling of the shops opposite the park today. Robert was insured through 4 insurers, and the total insurance came to £650, but he had lost £1,200. Nerd note, he had lost the equivalent of $100,000, but he needed $187,000. So yes, he lost a lot through the fire. Robert Henry Cowell is the 4th child of 11, but the first boy of 3, born to Robert Robinson and Elizabeth in Launceston, Tasmania in 1855. His father, Robert, was an architect and building surveyor. Robert came to Melbourne, settling in Footscray where he trained as a chemist and a dentist. In 1876, Robert rented off the Humphreys as he worked as a druggist. Robert moved to Walhalla. He kept in touch with the Humphreys as he was hoping, instead of being his landlord, they'd give him their 20-year-old daughter's hand in marriage. Gertrude Humphreys was the youngest of 6 children, born to William and Mary Maloney in Melbourne in 1859. Her parents both appear to be immigrants and have very common names, so without more context clues, finding out who they are is very difficult. Gertrude's mother passed away when she was 17, the same year Robert rented the property off her father. Married in 26 June 1879 in Walhalla, Gertrude 20 and Robert 23. Claribel Josephine Cowell joined them this year. The very next year, Lydia Teresa Cowell was born. Gertrude had 2 happy years with her husband and young daughters. She had developed consumption and lost a lot of weight. Her lymph nodes protruded from her neck. She succumbed to tuberculosis and died in 1882. Gertrude is buried in the Walhalla Cemetery. Nerd note. TB or tuberculosis is a bacterial infection which generally attacks the lungs. After the invention of antibiotics, its lethalness dropped. In 1904, there was a lot more information regarding and reducing infection through the family. Robert, with 2 young girls and a business in 1883, remarried Isabella Young, who was 24 years old. Isabella was born in Victoria, a suburb of Melbourne, in 1859 to James and Lynella. Robert and Isabella supported their local community by donating awards. For the entire 1890 cricket season, a gold pocket watch was the centre of their front window display, earmarked for setting into a trophy for the Walhalla cricketers who were competing for it. Robert was part of a number of community organisations, including the Oddfellows, Freemasons and Rifle Club. He participated in most tournaments and was a decent shot. The front window also displayed the 1896 Fire Brigade Cup won by 3 of the local firefighters, Alf Willis, Al Willis and J. Davidson. This cup wasn't one you could actually drink from, as is tradition. It had an ornamental carving of St. George holding up a glass bowl standing over a slain dragon. Each of the men added their personal awards, as well as all the team awards. The demonstration which this was awarded for was for competing in engine practice in 21 seconds. It's believed this is a burnover drill, which means preparing the engine for flames to come and for all the people there to survive. Robert kept strong connections with Footscray and organised a committee to help bring down the Fitzroy cricketers to play the locals in Walhalla over Easter 1896. It was a great game which everyone enjoyed. In 1897, along with creating his own remedies, performing dental work in a surgery out the back of his store front, sold medicines, tobacco and fancy gifts. A quick nerd note, I found it super odd that a chemist would sell tobacco products. But that is the context of living in times after the dangers have been proven, and that led me to wonder, and you might want to know, if they did. Well, according to the Pharmacy Board of Australia, pharmacies in Australia have never sold tobacco products. It's against the guidelines and law. This was written in relation to a debate around moving tobacco products to be a controlled substance sold by pharmacies. Anyway, that's a really big red herring from where we want to be. So I wanted to know when the organisation commenced, and it looked like the Pharmacy Board of Australia commenced around 1906. However, chemists could join the South Australia Pharmacy Board, which commenced in 1897, supported by corresponding legislation in South Australia. I hope that solved your curiosity. It answered my question. So, back to Robert Henry Cowell, entrepreneur. His wife would have had a large role in the shop, ensuring the smooth running of the day as he worked making preparations and fixing teeth. He had the top-of-the-range equipment for solving people's dental issues. Isabella managed the diary sales and ensuring the aesthetics of the shop. In 1899, Robert Henry Cow was one of the few shopkeepers who did not live on his premises. He had left for the day, leaving his assistant there, who appears like he does live on the premises and helps people with issues arising over the night. The assistant unfortunately isn't named, but around 11:30 p.m, someone came in needing physio. The assistant took this person into a back room where it was dispensed. While distracted, a window in the front was smashed near the door, which allowed the thieves or thief to remove the bolt and enter. They didn't dally and went straight to the jewellery cabinet, stealing £50 worth of brooches and rings. They went by the till and took the 25 shillings, leaving before they were seen. They went on to the drapery store, entering in a similar fashion. In 1910, Robert had the opportunity to take over a local dentist practice in Bairnsdale. Walhalla was winding down anyway, so he moved further east. There he fished, joining the Anglers Club, and quickly became an active part of the community. He was seen as a healthy man, so it was a surprise to Bairnsdale to learn on the 20th of January 1917 Robert experienced chest pain in the night. He took some form of medication described as a palliative, which would indicate a pain relief form of medication, which is not considered curative. The pain had subsided, and he seemed to feel better. His wife, an hour later, decided his condition required a doctor. Dr. Alsop arrived in time to pronounce Robert dead, even though he arrived very quickly after being called. No, this is not medical advice but information. Today we know experiencing chest pain or discomfort can be very serious, and the best course of action is to contact emergency services immediately, especially if there is shortness of breath or difficulty breathing with or without chest discomfort, sweating or a cold sweat. The quicker you get medical attention, the more likely your chances of survival are. Isabella and Robert didn't have any children. Robert's father, Robert Robinson Cow, was there to bury his son. He died 9 months later in October in Ascot Vale, Melbourne. Robert Henry was a Blue Ribbon member. It was associated with the temperance movement. The temperance movement wore a blue ribbon because of a verse in the Bible, Numbers 15:38-39, which says, "Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make them fringes in the borders of their garments throughout the generations, and that they put them upon the fringe of the borders in a riband of blue. And it shall be unto you for a fringe, that ye may look upon it, and remember the commandments of the Lord, and do them." It had started off in America by Francis Murphy. This movement had a fairly decent following during 1880 through to 1907. Albert Harris owned a grocery store. However, he was not living in Walhalla at the time his grocery store went up in 1888. This was a business he shared with Buchanan, who was also a mining manager with the United Buchanan Mines. At the time of the fire in 1888, Albert Harris was living in St Kilda with his wife, whose health was ailing. He and his business partner lost their entire store in the inferno engulfing the business district. Albert also had more to lose because he owned shares in the gold mining operation. Albert Abraham Harris, at 9 years old, went to school. His mother sold clothes. His oldest brother worked as a tailor and a barber. His sister a dressmaker. Another brother sold cigars. They were supporting the family after his father's death. Adelaide at 14 and John 12 years old were also looking for work. They had a servant named Anne Morgan. Oh, I want to thank so much the people on Facebook who helped me decipher the jobs of the mother and the brother. The mother is actually a dealer in clothes, the term they used on her census data, and the oldest brother is an outfitter, a tailor and barber. Albert arrived in Melbourne in 1864. Albert married his wife at the Anglican Church of Walhalla. Albert took on public service, campaigning and advocating for his town, leading to a term as Mayor of Walhalla between 1875 to 1876. He then ran for the Victorian Parliament in 1883. He was successful and held this position until 1910. The Moe Register Narrackenshire Advocate in 1889 applauded Albert Harris for completing his parliamentary duties and pledges to the residents of the North Gippsland government area. Albert Harris, member for the Legislative Assembly for North Gippsland, lived in Walhalla and wanted the railway department to test the viability of putting through a train line which would help bring through greater amounts of goods required by the town. The ironic thing is, when the railway was completed, people chose to leave the town with the possessions they'd accumulated. This came in conjunction with the gold mining determining the cost outweighed the benefit and closed in 1914. Albert, in 1910, after a period of ill health, moving into a private hospital in St Kilda, died of heart failure. Frederick Cranch Trix lost his law and accountancy offices during a fire. He was also a council member this year. Frederick would have felt the flames quite personally as they consumed the town he loved and his neighbours' businesses. He didn't live in the law offices. He was the third child born of 9 to William a blacksmith and Fanny Trix in Exeter, England in 1836. By 1851, Frederick was a junior clerk in a law office. Frederick arrived in Australia in 1854, originally working in Melbourne. However, gold glistened in his eyes. As the Ballarat gold rush was going strong, he saw the opportunities a solid, hard-working business lawyer would have and moved west. The gold rush dulled by 1861. He chased a few others, landing in Bendigo in 1864, where at 28 years old he met Mary Ann Hunt, 33. They had 4 children over the next 10 years before getting married. Mary was also an immigrant. Her hometown was Westbury, Gloucester. Born to James Hunt, a coachman, and Mary Nee Morris. Her birth was registered by the Quakers. A midwife, Elizabeth, witnessed her birth. She worked as an assistant before getting married in 1854 to James Lindrier. Together, they moved out to Australia, where they had 4 children. Their last child was born in 1859. The children moved with their mother into the home of their stepfather, Frederick Trix. It is difficult to understand what happened, as the records surrounding why the marriage ended are missing, and most genealogists seem to believe John died in South Australia between 1926 and 1930. However, this seems odd. It makes more sense that the relationship deteriorated. Mary left with the children, including her eldest, who married in 1872 in Raywood, a suburb near Bendigo. And in 1874, I believe a divorce was finalised, or John Lindrier died, because this is when Fred and Marianne married. Anyway, their 5th child was born this year in Walhalla. It had taken Frederick 10 years of the gold rush in Walhalla to decide it was a good move for his family. As he discovered, rushes were fleeting, with great setup costs and networking while getting to know the new community. Frederick Cranch Trix was a busy man. He was appointed in 1878 Magistrate and Justice of the Peace for the Walhalla area. He was also a broker for insurance. He worked as an assistant mine manager and opened some valuable mines, including Choomboon and New Loch Fyne. He campaigned for local government, and by 1891 he was the Shire President of Walhalla. This year he was struck with influenza and confined to bed rest. The Walhalla Shire over these years was advocating and improving the roads in and out of Walhalla, while also advocating for the 25 miles of rail connecting it to the Moe line. They had to network with other local councils because residents, especially those in Toongabbie, did not want the railway to go through their farms. Part of his duties as a lawyer saw him oversee the liquidation of the Blue Jacket mine at Walhalla in 1891. Including protecting and charging a grocer against trespassing on the land. Frederick was the president of the Rifle Club. As part of his duties, he had purchased a silver tea kettle trophy, which was on display in Cow's Pharmacy, again, for the locals and the shooters to visit, inspiring them to aim true. People who have target practice as a hobby talk about the need for calm, and relying on one's breath to get the best conditions for a bullseye. Frederick would have appreciated this calm before the shot. In 1895 he left Walhalla for the city, where he lived on Melbourne Road in Armidale, Victoria, as a broker with the stock exchange. In Melbourne he took on bowling, lawn bowls. Still about concentration and breath, except the noise reduced. He was a member of the Armidale Bowls Club. In 1906, his wife Marianne died. 9 years later, he decided to remarry at 79 years of age, Mary Ann Pym, 45. Mary Ann was born in 1870 in Dorset, England. She married her first husband in Somerset, England, 1887 to Charles John Viander. He passed away in 1894. She was widowed and pregnant at 24 years of age, with 4 young sons in a new country in Cheltenham, a suburb of the Mornington Peninsula. In 1915, the same year she married Frederick, 2 of her sons were fighting in the First World War. Louis G., her eldest son, went missing during the Lone Pine Battle. He later turned up among the deceased. He was buried in Gallipoli. Frederick and Mary Ann had 13 years together before he passed away at 92 years of age. Another property which was lost in the conflagration of 1888 was the sharebroker's office. Charles Raffard, Catherine, Doris Kate 8, and George 5 did not live at the sharebroker's office. However, it did disrupt his work, as he lost his building with all his paperwork. Every week he updated the newspapers and shareholders on how the mines were operating, how much had been mined, and if there were union actions or other issues which were affecting the mining, like bouts of influenza. He'd been living and working in Walhalla for at least 10 years prior to the fire. It was at the height of wealth coming in from the mines. £1 million in dividends had already been paid. Charles enjoyed supporting his community by joining a committee to run calico balls and play music. He shared this with his family, who too, 8 years after the fire, were all musicians, playing and entertaining the locals. They were members of the Church of England. Doris, at 5 years old, with the help of her mother, ran a stall. George grew up to be a miner. Charles approached life with energy, throwing himself into work, family, music, and community. He was an approachable man, networking with people who could invest and gaining the information required from the minds around him. He arrived aboard a ship called Richard as a bachelor in Melbourne at 23 years of age in 1859 from Hamburg, Germany. Raffard is a German last name derived from words meaning powerful and peace. In 1907, Charles watched the downturn in the mining, forecasting this was bad for his entire business, but also for the other people who were invested. While he was reporting this and sharing his concerns, it played heavily on him. People would attribute these concerns to the blood vessel in his brain bursting, with stroke claiming his life 2 days later. Charles was right. In 1910, when the train line finally reached the town, people chose to leave, including his family, who moved to New Zealand, when in 1914 the mines ended up closing shops. John Finlayson, a 21-year-old newlywed, excited to start his own family, raced into a burning home. Flaming debris rushed at him as he pushed through to the bassinet where the screaming baby thrashed. He scooped up the infant, pressing its small body into his chest, preventing embers landing on the nightgown. He burst out onto the street, gasping for breath. The parents came over as he handed the baby to them. The mother's ashen tear-streaked face lit up in a huge smile. She settled her child cradled in her arms. He watched her disappear into the smoke. Another community member came up to him, urgently asking if he was okay. Then he noticed his arms stung. Looking down, he saw his arms were badly burnt, and he sought out medical attention. At this time, he didn't know, as a result of his quick action and others, there was no loss of life. John had lost his eldest brother, Robert, in June of this year, while 2 sisters died before John would remember them. He went on to compete in fire brigade demonstrations, where he placed regularly in hurdles and other drills, which were performed at different locations around the state, showing the athletic and technical prowess of the firefighters, especially during the years 1888 to 1894. John Finlayson was born the 5th child of 12 at Woods Point, it's in the same area as Walhalla, in 1867, to his namesake, John, a farmer and Scottish immigrant, and Lucy Sarah Neefoot. His parents were married in Australia in 1862. In 1888, John married 21-year-old Charlotte Andrews in Walhalla. Charlotte was born in 1867 in Chiltern, Victoria. To Joseph Andrews, a blacksmith, and Mary, they had 8 children over the course of their marriage. John became the mine manager, his firstborn son he named after his brother, Robert John Stanley, became a metallurgist, a mineral scientist, and worked with his father. In World War I, Robert signed up. There he died in France during action in 1917. John left Walhalla and mining to become hotel keepers of the Criterion in Sale, Victoria. While nobody reportedly died in the Great Fire of Walhalla, grocer Richard and his family, who lived at the back of the store in the main business street of Walhalla, felt this loss immensely. It came on the back of burying 8 children over the past 28 years, some shortly after birth and others for different reasons. It was too much. His health was probably also prematurely failing. Richard was 48 years old. 5 years later he died. His wife Elizabeth followed him the year after. Only 2 of their 10 children were alive to mourn their parents. Richard had made the most of his time in Walhalla, having moved there with his mother, who lived there until 1906 when she passed away. Richard Dunn leased an allotment of land which he had worked north of Cohen's Claim. It ended up having a decent amount of rock pulled from it since 1868 until he chose to sell it in 1888 after the fire, losing everything, saying he was finding everything too hard due to the number of family deaths. One of the few brick buildings was beside the wooden post office. This building and the wind changing saved the post office. The fire also swept into the yard of the Long Tunnel mine. This is right in the middle of the business district of town. Workers filled the yards. Woolen blankets soaked with water, what was left in Stringers Creek, were carried covering the machinery, while the men beat back the embers with what can best be described as lacrosse sticks, although the end, instead of being an inflexible, was leather. The urgency to save the Long Tunnel mine works succeeded. A lot of equipment was here, and it was the most successful gold mine for many years. The destruction of this would have caused the death blow to the town much earlier than 1914. While people came together to help each other, others took advantage of the flames and stole property from their neighbours, including alcohol from the hotels, right in front of the keepers. While these people probably thought they were saving it from certain flames, it probably wasn't the best way to help community cohesion in the aftermath. A lot of people left the town, and some didn't even rebuild, especially because many people would have felt trapped. There was no way a person could outrun the blaze by climbing the cliff faces, and may not have felt they could get out of the gorge quickly enough either. Next time on Haunted Hills Small Towns Big Stories is Walhalla True Crime. Join us for that. Thank you so much for your time, I truly appreciate it. If you crave more Haunted Hills, help us grow so we can deliver you more episodes. You can do this by sharing episodes, joining us on patreon.com/Haunted Hills, leaving a review, or supporting our advertisers. There are so many small towns we're obsessed with, like Roswell, New Mexico, because aliens, Melissa, Iowa, because of the Axe Murder House, and many others. I'll soon be updating the calendar on our website at hauntedhillstours.com.au, so you can check it out. If you have some suggestions or stories, I'd like to hear them and add them to our list. Thank you so much for your time, I truly appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about a different time and the people who lived then. Tegan Dawson produced, researched, wrote and narrated this episode on Gunaikurnai land in Moe Victoria. Haunted Hills acknowledges the Bradalong people of the Gunaikurnai Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land they operate on. Much of the country they speak of is Aboriginal land, always was, always is. We respect the elders, people, culture, past, present, and hope for a positive future on all these lands that were never ceded. The intro and outro was created by Aranosta Music. You can chat with us on the socials, Facebook at Haunted Hills Pod, Twitter at haunt_hills, or our pod website, hauntedhillstours.com.au. There you'll find things to do in the towns we talk about, also sometimes what life was like, plus other things that we've done surrounding the towns. Thank you again for your time, be kind, stay safe.